Okay, so this is chapter 15, the brain and cranial nerves. Maybe some of you guys have the notes printed out, but I'm going to highlight the note questions as we go through this, just because those are questions that'll be on your next lecture exam. I'm also going to try to highlight, because we're not doing lab together, I posted some lab PowerPoints online of lab models, and I know it just doesn't take the place of seeing the models in class, so I'm going to try to cover a lot of the terms on your lab exam that you might see, or important ones as well. But this, we'll just look at anatomy of the brain and anatomy of the cranial nerve. So it'll get a little detailed, and I might skip over some slides that you don't need to know about. But we'll first talk about the 4 regions of the brain, and we'll go a little bit into brain anatomy, and then we'll start to answer some of your note questions. So it'll take me a minute to get to number 1. But the 4 major regions of the brain are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And we'll talk about those 4 major regions and what they look like. I'll show you a picture of these, but in the cerebrum of the brain, it's wrinkled. I call them brain guts. If I had a brain here, I would show it to you. But the folds are called gyri, and the depressions between the folds are called sulci for plural. So a gyrus is singular, like a singular brain fold, a piece of tissue or piece of cerebrum that's wrinkled. And a sulcus is singular, it's any depression between the fold. We use anterior and posterior to describe the anatomy of the brain. The word rostral means toward the nose, so closer to the front of the face, and caudal means towards the tail, just as we describe some parts of the brain itself. So if you look at this, can you guys see my cursor moving around?
Yes.
Yes. Good, okay. So if we look at each one of these wrinkles in the brain is called a gyrus. So each brain fold is called a gyrus. And you can see the gyruses or brain folds or wrinkles all over the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is what makes up this upper top part of the brain itself. The cerebellum is its own separate structure that's below the cerebrum. The cerebellum is really important for maintaining equilibrium and posture and balance. And then your brain stem refers to the part of the brain that will eventually connect the brain itself, the cerebrum, to the spinal cord right below it. So if we look at the cerebrum, these brain folds have depressions between them. And one major depression we call and name anatomically is the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is a major depression between 2 gyri on either side. The lobes of the brain are also labeled on this picture. The frontal lobe will be right below your frontal bone, so right where your forehead is. Your temporal lobe will be right underneath your temporal bone, so where your ear will be. The occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, and then the parietal lobes are just what make up over the top of the brain. So you can see here that these sulci, or sulcus for singular, they are major depressions within the gyri that will separate out the lobes of the brain. So the central sulcus is between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. We have a lateral sulcus that borders the temporal lobe. And some of these sulci are listed in your lab exam study sheet. So I'm going to try to highlight the ones that are on there. I think I did. Any questions about this so far? Just wanted to point out that. This is what your brain actually looks like. So if we were to remove it from your bodies right now, it wouldn't be this pink because you'd still see the blood vessels if you were recently alive. But this is a cadaver brain. So it shows you, you can see the sulci, the depressions a lot more prominently, and those gyri, the brain folds, a lot more prominently. And again, the lobes are all named for what skull bone they lie underneath. And then the 2 major sulci that you should know are the central sulcus between the frontal and parietal lobe, and the lateral sulcus, which borders the temporal lobe. The cerebellum kind of looks like ground beef.
Ew.
I just noticed that. Spaghetti, probably more like ground beef. All right, if we look at the underside of the brain, so we're looking at the brain from the bottom up, anything that you see yellow in this picture is a nerve that's coming off a part of the brain or a part of the brain stem. And most of them, I think all of them listed here, are cranial nerves. And you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So 12 pairs, you mean you have one or two of each. Cranial, you have a cranial nerve going to the eyeball, which is your optic nerve. You have olfactory nerves, which help you smell. And then you have more cranial nerves working your way down, coming off parts of the brain and the brainstem. Okay. Again, a cadaver view of that. If we separate out the brain into the two hemispheres, so your brain, you have a right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. And if we separate them out, if we were to cut right down the middle of your brain, we would have to cut through what we call the corpus callosum, which is this C-shaped structure. It's a thick structure that connects both hemispheres of the brain together. And it's the only major pathway of communication between the two hemispheres. So again, your brain is kind of, it's not wobbly, but it's only connected together between the right and the left hemispheres with this corpus callosum. So this view of the brain is showing as if we were to cut down the middle of your brain and then open it up, a medial view of it. So here's your corpus callosum. It connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Within the diencephalon, that's in bold here, we have an interthalamic adhesion. It's this little bullseye structure. That just means it's helping to adhere both sides of the brain within a structure called the thalamus. And we'll talk about what the thalamus is and why that is important. And right below the thalamus, we have a structure called the hypothalamus, which is very important in regulating your endocrine systems. Your hypothalamus is directly connected to your pituitary gland, and your pituitary gland is what secretes a lot of your hormones in the endocrine system. So your hypothalamus will send out releasing factors that tells your pituitary gland what hormones to secrete. Again, you guys should really focus on learning just anatomy of this, and physiology. You'll learn more about what these structures actually do. But again, I'm trying to highlight things on your lab exam you should look for as well. In the cerebellum, which is the ground beef structure, if you want to call it that, the cerebellum itself has this tree-like branching, which is not labeled, but it has this area of white matter that looks like tree branches, and that's called arbor vitae, which will probably be labeled in a different picture. Then the brainstem, we have the midbrain, which is this teeny tiny little section that connects up to the thalamus and the diencephalon. The pons is a little kind of out pocket, a bulge of the brainstem. And then the medulla oblongata is the part of the brain that's most caudal or furthest towards the tail. And the medulla oblongata is what will connect directly with your spinal cord going out the bottom. I know that's a lot of information, but I just wanted to go over that quickly, and then we'll go over it a little more in detail. Okay, yeah, that's good for now. I'll keep going. All right, within the areas of the brain, there's gray matter and white matter. And you might have noticed on those pictures that some parts of the brain look really gray and other parts look white. Gray matter means that that is the part of the brain that's housing all your motor neurons and just basically the cell bodies, the dendrites, and anything unmyelinated. And then white matter is made up of myelinated axons. Because myelin is white, that's what gives white matter it a little bit whiter in color, because it's made up of myelinated axons. So here's a cross-section of the brain. You can see just the difference in colors between the white matter, more located centrally, and the gray matter is located on the edges of the brain. And really the difference in color is just that the white matter is made up of myelinated axons because myelin is white. And that same white and gray matter follows all the way down the spinal cord into this structure. This picture down here, you can see the outer white matter and the inner gray matter. Okay, so here are some structures and their description of the nervous system. I'm gonna skip over this now for now. Okay. All right, the brain is protected by many structures. The bony cranium, you guys remember all the bones, hopefully, that protect the cerebrum itself. And then it's protected by what we call meninges. And those are the protective connective tissue layers. And we'll start to get into number 1 and number 2 and number 3 and number 4 here. So it's protected by those meninge connective tissue layers. Also, it's protected with cerebrospinal fluid. That's what CSF stands for. As well, it's protected by the blood-brain barrier. Do you guys remember from last time what cells helped make up the blood-brain barrier? Their little feet that wrapped around the capillaries. The astrocytes, maybe? Okay. So the meninges, these are layers of connective tissue that cover the cerebrum itself. They separate the brain from the bones of the cranium. So underneath your skull bones, we don't just get your cerebrum right away. We have these 3 layers of connective tissue, and we call them meninges. A meninx, which you can see that word in number 3 and 4 of your notes, or the meninx, that's just means a singular layer. So you might see the meninx word as well. They protect blood vessels of the brain. They contain and circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll talk about the importance of that. And then these are the 3 layers of meninges. And from deep to superficial, to answer the question to number 1 in your notes, the order of meninges from deep to superficial, the pia mater is the deepest because this is the thin innermost layer. It adheres to all of the sulci and crevices and depressions and gyri of the brain itself. So the pia mater is the deepest layer. And then moving more superficially, we have the arachnoid mater, which has little trabeculae or branches that resemble a spider web. That's how it gets its name, arachnoid. Right beneath the arachnoid mater layer, we have a subarachnoid space, which is an area between the arachnoid and pia layers. And then the dura mater is the tough outer layer with 2 sublayers. It has an inner meningeal layer and an outer periosteal layer. So this slide kind of answers many questions on your notes. Number 1, deep to superficial, the layers go pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater. If I ask you on a test, what are the cranial meninge layers from superficial to deep, it would go dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. Which of the cranial meninges consists of dense irregular connective tissue in 2 layers? That's the dura mater layer. That's the answer to number 2 on your notes. And then what meninx layer is composed of a delicate web of collagen and elastic fibers? That web is referring to the trabeculae in the arachnoid mater layer. So number 3 is arachnoid mater. And then number 4, the thin layer that follows every contour of the brain. That would be the pia mater layer. So that answers number 5, excuse me, or number 4, excuse me. Okay. So this is a look, if we were looking at the brain itself, you can see the skin of your scalp, which is actually extremely thin. The periosteum, again, is just a covering on bone. So then you'll see your skull bone. And then you'll see these 3 layers and they're bolded for you. So the dura mater is bolded and it's showing you the 2 layers that make up the dura mater. And then you have the arachnoid mater, which you'll see kind of this web of fibers within it. You'll see the subarachnoid space, and then you'll see the pia mater, which will follow every contour of the brain. Okay, questions on the meninges or meninge layers? Okay. Ventricles of the brain, there are cavities within the brain that contain cerebrospinal fluid. You have 4 ventricles or spaces within the brain that contain this special type of fluid that we're going to talk about. There's 2 lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere. They're separated by a thin tissue layer called the septum pellucidum. You have a 3rd ventricle located in the diencephalon, and I'll show you where that is and what that means. And then there's a 4th ventricle between the pons and the cerebellum. This 4th ventricle will merge with your central canal of your spinal cord, and that just means that your 4th ventricle is a space containing cerebrospinal fluid, and it'll carry cerebrospinal fluid all the way down your spinal cord. So that's how doctors, when they get a spinal tap, they're testing the contents of your cerebrospinal fluid that was initially created within the ventricles of the brain and is just kind of continuous within that central canal of the spinal cord. So in gray here is a look at these ventricles. The 2 lateral ventricles are kind of C-shaped. They fall kind of, or they border the top of that corpus callosum structure. And all the ventricles are connected. Again, there's spaces within the brain that contain fluid. The 3rd ventricle is right in the middle where your thalamus would be located. And then your 4th ventricle is located right in front of your cerebellum. So here's your 4th ventricle. You'll see how the 3rd and the 4th ventricle are connected by the cerebral aqueduct. So you can see how all the ventricles are connected and eventually lead into the central canal of the spinal cord, which will carry cerebrospinal fluid all the way down your spinal cord.
Professor?
Yes.
I'm kind of having difficulty like visualizing how this picture is supposed to be. Is it on the outside of like the brain, or is it on the...
Great question. No, it's on the inside of the brain.
Okay, so it's deeper. Okay.
Yeah,
is it in like the white matter or something, or?
Yes, it's within the white matter. So it's spaces within the cerebrum.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Great question. I know this is so abstract, isn't it? Let me see. Nope, that's the only picture I have for you. Yeah, so think of within the brain, you have spaces, and these are spaces within the brain that contain fluid. They're all connected. When I told you where they're located, those were just general terms, kind of what structure they're located around. And then they'll eventually connect down. If we were to take a cross section of your spinal cord and look at it, we would see a little circle in the middle where that central canal would be.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, Hannah. Yeah. The brain is a really abstract. No one really likes the nervous system or the brain. But if you do, that's great. But students find this just to be one of the more challenging parts. Digestive system is fun. Reproductive, urinary, it's all stuff you can like see, but the brain is hard because you don't really get a lot of nervous system until probably this class. Okay, so I've talked a lot about CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, but what is it? Number 5 and 7 have to do with cerebral spinal fluid. The functions are listed for you there. It's a type of liquid that's clear. It circulates within the ventricles and the subarachnoid space, and it goes all the way down your spinal cord. It's formed by the choroid plexus, and I underlined that because that is a question. That's number 7, and that'll be an exam question. What forms the cerebral spinal fluid? And that's the choroid plexus. And I'll try to show you a picture of that after this slide. The functions of the cerebrospinal fluid is the question for number 5 in your notes. So what does this fluid do? It helps to create buoyancy of the brain. So your brain isn't just dead, kind of sitting in the base of your cranial fossa. It's floating, so it helps to create it, make it float basically. It helps to protect the brain. So if you were to bang your head up against the wall, if you're stuck inside with kids and want to do that, I don't know. But it'll help to provide a liquid cushion. If you think about it, the brain itself, if it's banging up against a layer of liquid first, because remember, cerebrospinal fluid is in that subarachnoid space as well, just helps to provide cushion to the brain. And then it transports nutrients and removes waste from the brain. So it helps to keep everything stable. So those are functions of CSF. The blood-brain barrier is part of this idea of protecting the brain. So we put it here. It regulates what substances can enter the interstitial fluid of the brain. And it's made of, what makes up the blood-brain barrier? Number 8, what makes up the blood-brain barrier? It's made up of endothelial cells and those astrocyte cells, specifically the astrocyte perivascular feet, which surround the capillaries. And I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide. The blood-brain barrier is missing or reduced in the choroid plexus, where cerebrospinal fluid is being made, the hypothalamus, and also the pineal gland. And for some reason, that's because some of the hormones, the pineal gland helps with your sleep and wake cycle. They don't want the blood-brain barrier to get in the way of messing up anything that could be going through the brain at that point. Let me see if I can get to functions. So here is a look at the blood-brain barrier. Again, it's made of those astrocyte cells with what we call perivascular feet, which are what kind of surrounding and making this barrier between whatever is inside the capillary. So if there's something harmful within your blood and it's taken up to the brain, these astrocytes will try to keep any sort of harmful substances from entering the brain tissue or your white or gray matter. Do you guys remember what are 2 things that can get through the blood-brain barrier? Talked about it on last week, I think. Nicotine and alcohol. So smoking and drinking. Nicotine and alcohol gets through the blood-brain barrier, so that's why you get such a sudden effect. I'm not a smoker. I used to be a drinker 6 months ago. I wish I was one now. No, I'm just teasing. Oh, I have a terrible joke. I should not say this because this is going over. But I joke with my husband. It's a good thing I can't drink right now. Well, it's a good thing I can't drink right now because we're stuck inside with kids, and it's just good I can't drink. But anyway, so but through this blood,
3 months to go.
I know it's not that long. You guys, and I'm not an alcoholic. I don't even drink that much, but just like a nice glass of wine would be nice sometimes. But all right. Anyway, the blood-brain barrier helps to protect the brain. That's the biggest function of the blood-brain barrier. So number 6 asks you for the function in your notes. And it just protects harmful substances that are in your blood from entering the brain tissue itself. So questions so far?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the answer to number 6?
So number 6, the functions of the blood-brain barrier are just to protect the brain tissue from harmful substances in the blood. So it acts as a barrier between whatever's in the blood in your body and the brain tissue.
Thank you.
Yes. And if you don't want to talk, you can always send me a chat question because that like pops up as a notification and I get those pretty well. Okay. So I think we answered all the way up through number 8.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the cerebrum, what was the cerebrum again? Do you guys, can you picture what the cerebrum is in your head?
Yes.
The cerebrum was all of the gyri and sulci, so it's all the brain ridges and folds and grooves and the fissures. So the cerebrum is basically it has all the lobes in the brain. It's the location of conscious thought and the origin of intellectual functions. It has an outer cortex and inner white matter and a deep region of gray matter. The surface of the brain, as you know, or of the cerebrum, is marked by those gyri, those ridges, the sulci, the grooves, and the deep fissures. So the cerebrum is composed into two halves called the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And the hemispheres are divided by a longitudinal fissure that extends along the mid-sagittal plane. So if you remember, the sagittal suture was right down the parietal bone. You have what we call a longitudinal fissure, which is a very deep depression. So a fissure is even a deeper depression than a sulcus. And this longitudinal fissure separates out the right hemisphere of the brain from the left hemisphere. The two hemispheres are separate, except at a few locations where bundles of nerve axons connect them. And the corpus callosum is that main pathway of communication between the right and the left hemispheres. And that's the answer to number 9, the corpus callosum. So that's number 9, the corpus callosum. A single region of the cortex can exhibit several different functions. Some of these functions are memory or consciousness. They cannot easily be assigned to a single region. Both the cerebral hemispheres generally receive sensory information from one side of the body and project motor commands to the opposite side of the body. So that just means if you touch a hot stove or if you step on a nail, that sensation of pain that you feel from the right side of your body will be, well, it'll be sensed in, those are different types of reflexes that go the same way, but other types of reflexes will be sensed on one side of the brain and a motor response will be sent out the other side of the brain, so that they control opposite sides of the body. They're mirror images, but they display some functional differences. Some of this you won't all need to know, but it's kind of interesting to learn a little bit about it. The lobes of the cerebrum, though, each hemisphere is divided into 5 distinct lobes, which I kind of talked a little bit about. We're going to go through these lobes. You should know what occurs in each lobe, and I take you through questions 10 to 13, kind of take you through questions about the lobes of the brain. So here you can see the longitudinal fissure separating out the left cerebral hemisphere from the right cerebral hemisphere. And you can see the lobes of the brain on the left side of the screen where the frontal lobe is, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And each lobe of the brain has a different function. So if you have a stroke in one part of the brain, or if you have an injury or you get in a car accident, different parts of the brain will affect you differently depending on what is injured. The brain is just a fascinating organ in my mind. And I mean, when someone is a brain surgeon, I truly think they're the smartest people ever because they just have to know so much. So into the different lobes of the brain, and this kind of tells you some of their functions. So for example, what is the function of the brain's frontal lobe? The frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex of the brain. We'll talk about what that means. That means that there's a part or a gyrus in your frontal lobe that controls all motor function. Then you have a motor speech area. You have concentration in the frontal lobe. You'll see the central sulcus here dividing the frontal lobe from your parietal lobe behind it. In the parietal lobe, this is where we have our primary somatosensory cortex. And that means the part of the brain which will take in all sensory stimulus from the body. The occipital lobe is your primary visual cortex center. So all sorts of vision and understanding and perceiving what you see happens in the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe, because it's next to your ear, this is the primary auditory cortex. So it has to do with perceiving all sounds that come into your ear and figuring out what that sound is associated with. The insula is a lobe of the brain that's deep within, kind of in the center of the brain. That's the primary gustatory cortex that helps with taste. Looking at this picture a little more, I just want to point out 2 more things. You'll notice in the frontal lobe, you'll see this gyrus that is colored blue. This gyrus we call the precentral gyrus, and we call it precentral because it's the gyrus in front of the central sulcus. So this gyrus is precentral in front of the central sulcus. Within the precentral gyrus is what we call the primary motor cortex. And again, that's the part of the brain that controls all motor function. So in number 13, when it asks you for the primary motor cortex, you can say that's part of the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe. Does that make sense to everybody? So the primary motor cortex is a part of your precentral gyrus, which is in blue here, which is a part of your frontal lobe. Number 12 then, the question right above that asks you for the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is describing the part of the brain that receives all sensory stimuli. And the primary somatosensory cortex is in what we call the postcentral gyrus. And it is labeled this yellowish color. And we call it post-central gyrus. Post means after. So post-central means after or behind the central sulcus. So your post-central gyrus contains the primary somatosensory cortex, and that is in the parietal lobe of the cerebrum itself. So those are the answers to 12 and 13. The precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus are folds in the brain bordering that central sulcus, and those are both on your lab exam study sheets too. Okay, what portion of the brain is involved with vision? By looking at this.
Occipital. Is it the frontal? Or is it occipital?
It's occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
So in the frontal lobe, it says that it's the frontal eye field, but then all the vision is processed in the occipital lobe. How does that work?
So frontal eye field, I think, and I'd have to double check this, I think it refers to the optic nerves that are coming and reaching out to the eyeballs. So the eye fields, your optic nerves are going to cross each other right underneath the frontal lobe. And the frontal eye field has to do with what the eyes are perceiving, and they cross each other when those optic nerves cross. But in terms of like taking what you see and processing that happens in the occipital lobe.
Okay, so the frontal is just basically there for seeing it, but it's not processed.
Because of the optic nerve is there, yes.
Okay.
And we'll go through, so I'm just going to start going through, and if you guys have another question, but this will take you through all the lobes in a little more detail too. The frontal lobe is deep to your frontal bone. It ends posteriorly at the central sulcus. The precentral gyrus is directly anterior to your central sulcus. And these are a lot of the frontal lobe functions that you can use to answer number 10. I talked a little bit about concentration, voluntary movement, verbal communication, decision planning, decision making, and personality all come from the frontal lobe. So those are functions of the frontal lobe. That gives you a little better detail than what that graph on the first slide showed. Okay, other questions? All right, so we'll move on to the parietal lobe. It's right underneath the parietal bone. It terminates anteriorly at the central sulcus. The postcentral gyrus is the ridge in the parietal lobe immediately posterior to that central sulcus. And the parietal lobe is involved with general sensory functions. And that's because it contains that somatosensory cortex in that postcentral gyrus. So that's parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is involved with hearing and smell. And then your occipital lobe is where the processing of all incoming visual information, storing visual memories occurs in the occipital lobe as well. Okay, so this is all of the lobes and their primary functions. And I think that takes us through the first page of your notes. So just holler at me. Okay. Just real briefly, we're going to talk a little more about the motor and sensory areas of the cerebrum. When I talk about an association area, that just means a place that integrates and stores any information. The primary motor cortex, remember, is located in your precentral gyrus in your frontal lobe. It's innervated to various body parts, and it can be diagrammed with what we call a motor homunculus on the precentral gyrus. And I just want to show you a picture of this because I think it's fascinating. So remember, each hemisphere of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So we're just looking at the left hemisphere right now. And this is in the precentral gyrus. So it's your primary motor cortex in your frontal lobe. And scientists, doctors have deciphered where each part of the brain is that controls each of these different body parts. So if you do have an injury in your pharynx or your tongue or your face or your neck, they know that it's referring to one of these areas of that precentral gyrus. For some reason, look at how much space your fingers get in the palm of your hand. That's because you have a lot of nerve endings in your fingers. So you have really precise control and very sensitive feeling in your fingers. So it's just kind of fascinating to me. I don't know if you guys think that, but to see all the parts of the brain and the places that they control. The speech area controls muscular movements. It's found in a portion of your left frontal lobe. Your frontal eye field, here you go, Aaliyah, helps control and regulate eye movements. So it helps to control the eye movements itself. So I'm sorry if I kind of misled you on that, but
No, that's okay.
But your frontal eye field, it'll help control your eye movements, and it makes sense that as the eye moves, it'll change your level of eye field, what it can take in.
Mm-hmm.
Then your primary somatosensory cortex, again, it's in the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. It receives all the general somatic sensory information from touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And again, it has the same sort of diagram, and it shows you where in the brain that it's receiving stimulus. So this is the right side of the brain receiving stimulus from the left side of the body, and where it receives those stimuli from. So if you have an injury to your lips, teeth, gums, and jaw, this part of the brain will probably be overwhelmed because it's receiving all that sensory stimuli coming from it. Again, your fingers and hands are extremely sensitive because they have a lot of nerve endings in them. So kind of interesting, I think. Then we have cortexes, which are just general areas that process this information. Your visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, auditory, temporal, gustatory, helps with taste, is in your insula, which again was your lobe inside of your brain, and olfactory is also in your temporal lobe. I'm gonna kind of go over these association areas pretty quick because you don't need to know all of this information. It takes you through association areas that, remember, help to store some of that information when it's not in process of being transmitted. Wernicke and Gnostic, don't worry about those. I keep them in here in case I ever have time to cover them. But higher processing centers, other association areas are considered higher order. They involve functions such as speech, cognition, understanding spatial relationships, and general interpretation. We could have a whole class on neurobiology and your brain. Okay, but let's get to the thalamus then. So your thalamus is the answer to number 14, and it's an incredibly important part of the brain. These are paired masses of gray matter that lie on each side of that third ventricle space. And the big thing I want you to know about the thalamus is that all sensory impulses from anything consciously perceived except smell converge or come to the thalamus and synapse. That means they kind of go onto another nerve in at least one of its nuclei. So basically the thalamus acts as this filter for all sensory information, and then it kind of tells what sensory information should continue on to that somatosensory cortex in your parietal lobe. So thalamus is the answer to 14 in your notes. Here's what your thalamus looks like. It's paired, meaning there's two kind of halves to it of gray matter. Again, the thalamus is extremely intricate. Your brains are probably exploding right now, literally. But your thalamus has different parts of it, and each different part of the thalamus can receive this different sensory signal from a different part of the body. Yeah, it's just a lot of information. But this is your thalamus. Just know what 14 is, and you'll be good. It has different nuclei within the lobes that do have different functions. You'll probably learn some of these in physiology because you'll learn where some of your reflexes occur. Then your hypothalamus is directly below your thalamus, and it controls your pituitary gland, and it has an infundibulum stalk which connects your hypothalamus to your pituitary gland. And I'm just going to show you this picture. So where my cursor is where your thalamus is located. And then your hypothalamus is showing all of these different colored nuclei in different bodies. And then the infundibulum is this small stalk or stick-like structure that connects your hypothalamus to your pituitary gland. And again, your hypothalamus sends out hormone-releasing signals that tells your pituitary gland what hormones to secrete. Lots of fun. So here's specific nuclei. These are the different functions of your hypothalamus. It controls your autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, which are all of your hormones, regulates body temperature, emotional behavior, food and water intake, regulates your sleep and wake, circadian rhythm cycles. So that's your hypothalamus. And I don't think I ask you too many questions about your hypothalamus because you will learn a lot about hormones and physiology. Brainstem then, it connects the forebrain and the cerebellum to the spinal cord. And forebrain just refers to what's kind of the bottom part of your cerebrum, and your cerebellum to your spinal cord. The three main regions of the brainstem are midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And let's just look here. Again, your diencephalon consisted of that thalamus structure, and then the brainstem. So think of this as kind of like a torch that holds the brain on top of it. So the brainstem and the diencephalon is just the structure you hold that holds the brain on top of it. That's a terrible analogy, but I kind of thought it made sense. Brainstem, so midbrain. There's different bodies and tracts of nerves that come out of each part of the brainstem. So whenever you see any little yellow line that's coming out, that refers to one of the cranial nerves that's coming out. The pons is the little enlarged structure that's kind of has a bump to it. And then the medulla oblongata is the most caudal part of the brain. So number 15 asks for the most caudal part of the brain. That means the part of the brain that's closest to your tail. And that medulla oblongata will continue on down as the spinal cord itself. Here's another view of the midbrain, or the diencephalon at the top. You can see your little pineal gland there. That also helps with sleep and wake cycles. The midbrain, that tectile plate, this is one that I crossed off of your lab exam, but those superior and inferior colliculi are important in the midbrain. There's your pons, and then the medulla oblongata itself. Okay, cerebral aqueduct, again, connects your third and fourth ventricles together. This talks about peduncles that you don't need to worry about. More fun and anatomical terms that I crossed off on your list. So I'm gonna just keep going here. Here's a midbrain cross-section view. This cross-section view of the midbrain, you don't need to worry about for anatomy, but when you get to physiology, you'll learn that parts of your reflex tracts from your nerves will synapse in this part of the midbrain. So you'll come back to this picture if you aren't scared to take physiology, which it's not bad at all. The pons is the bulging region on the anterior brainstem. We have more anatomical terms that I'm just going to cross over from now. The medulla oblongata then is the most inferior part of the brainstem. It has pyramids that are composed of different motor projection tracts. Those tracts will cross in your medulla at what we call the decussation of the pyramids. I'm just going to say decussation because that means to cross over. And you'll hear that word again, but not in anatomy. And I'm going to keep going. I know it seems like we're going a lot here, but I don't ask you guys to know much else. Medulla oblongata nuclei are involved with coughing, sneezing, salivation, swallowing, gagging, and vomiting. So that will be some of the autonomic nuclei, autonomic nervous system control. Okay, let's keep going then. I can never see the top of my screen here. Let me just check. Oh, the cerebellum. This is something I do want to talk about. Yes. My menu always hides the title of my slides. So the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. The cerebellum itself has internal region of white matter, which is what we call arbor vitae. That's the part that looks like a tree. It also has hemispheres to it and folds to it, but I'm just going to show you a picture of your cerebellum here. These arbor vitae are these branches of white matter that look like a tree. And I think arbor vitae is in your lab list. Just knowing that inside the cerebellum, it looks like tree branches. We call that arbor vitae. The functions of the cerebellum, and this will help you answer number 17, are coordinating and fine-tuning movements, storing memories of previously learned movement patterns like playing the piano or other instruments or riding a bike. And it helps to adjust your muscle activity to maintain equilibrium and posture. So the idea of just maintaining balance happens in your cerebellum. It uses proprioceptive information from your muscles and joints to regulate the body's position. So proprioceptive information is just the ability of your muscles and joints to know where they are in relation to each other. So this all happens in the cerebellum, a really important part of the body. So number 17, the answer to number 17, equilibrium, posture, adjusting skeletal muscle activity, that all happens in the cerebellum. Okay, and then we end this lecture with the cranial nerves. I know this is one of the bulkier lectures. I think in person, this one usually takes at least a good hour and a half. And I know I'm going through it faster with you guys here. So there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. I won't have you guys memorize what they all do, just the ones that are listed on your notes here, you should be able to know. As we go through cranial nerves, they're all numbered with Roman numerals by their position from anterior to posterior. And the names of the nerves generally are related to their function. So cranial nerve number 1 is the most anterior cranial nerve, and that's the answer to number 16, and that's your olfactory nerve. So you can see your olfactory nerve in yellow a little bit better on the artistic drawing. It reaches out to the front of your nose, and if you remember, you have parts of your olfactory nerve that go through the cribriform plate, through your ethmoid bone to help you smell. So there's your olfactory nerve, the most anterior nerve.
Is that also the answer to number 20?
It is also the answer to number 20. Thanks, Erin. The other big one that I want you to know is these optic nerves cross each other in this X-like structure called the optic chiasm. And the optic chiasm is just the crossing where your optic nerves cross each other. You'll see other cranial nerves coming out at different locations seen there too. Okay, so real quick, we're gonna go through olfactory nerve helps with smell. You can see the olfactory nerve and the pieces of the olfactory nerve going through the cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone. The optic nerve crosses, so there's one optic nerve, this is cranial nerve number 2 going to one eye, and the other optic nerve goes to the other eye. They attach to the back of the eyeball. We'll talk about optic nerves and eyes in chapter 19. So there's your optic nerve, so they contain all special sensory nerve of vision. So anything that you guys are seeing come through the optic nerve. Then the oculomotor nerve controls the movement of the 6, or not all of them, 4 of the eye muscles. And the ocular motor nerve is the answer to number 19. So your ocular motor nerve has branches that goes to eye muscles that surround the eyeball itself. It supplies 4 extrinsic eye muscles. So your superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and an inferior oblique eye muscle. So your ocular motor nerve. That's cranial nerve number 3. And again, if you remember, they're numbered by Roman numerals going from anterior to posterior. Number 4 is the trochlear nerve. This supplies your superior oblique muscle with movement. The trigeminal nerve innervates muscles of mastication. So it helps with chewing. So that's the primary motor function of your trigeminal nerve. Some other muscles that have to do with swallowing as well. The trigeminal nerve is called tri because it has 3 big branches that come off of it. So that's cranial nerve number 5. The abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle for eye abduction. So lateral rectus moves your eyeball laterally. Your facial nerve then, this will be the answer to number 18. Your facial nerve is an important nerve. It has a lot of motor functions because it has 5 major motor branches of it, and it innervates muscles of facial expression, the posterior belly of your digastric muscle, and the stylohyoid and stapedius muscle. And it specifically, also the parasympathetic motor function is to increase secretions of your lacrimal gland of the eye, as well as some of your salivary glands. So your facial nerve has a lot of different branches going everywhere in the face, helps to chew, not to chew, excuse me, helps all the muscles of facial expression, as well as innervating the lacrimal gland and some salivary glands. So that's the answer to number 18. And I think from there we answered all the questions. So I'll finish up with the facial nerves. The vestibulocochlear nerve conducts impulses for equilibrium and hearing. So it's divided into a vestibular branch that goes to the vestibule and the cochlear branch that goes to the cochlea. And we'll learn all about the ear in chapter 19. Glossopharyngeal nerve innervates some pharynx muscle, also innervates one of your salivary glands. And then the vagus nerve is unique because your vagus, not to be confused with the vagus, it's the only cranial nerve that actually leaves like your head region, and it'll travel down and it'll innervate parts of your cardiac muscle, glands of the heart, your lungs, your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea. So it's the only cranial nerve that actually leaves the head region. So this is cranial nerve number 10. Then we have the accessory nerve, which innervates your trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. And then the last one we have is the hypoglossal nerve, which innervates some intrinsic and extrinsic tongue muscles. Oh good, we didn't really lose any participants. I don't know if you're all listening, but we didn't lose too many participants there. Okay. I know that was a lot. How are you guys doing?
Okay.
As good as can be.
I'm going to stop the recording.